Before we begin, if you're enjoying stories of faith, resilience, and love in the Old West, remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves inspiring frontier tales. Now, let's journey back into Montana territory, where a marriage meant to destroy one man's future became the beginning of an extraordinary blessing. Montana Territory, 1886. Morning sunlight spilled across the endless prairie, turning the sea of tall grass into waves of gold that stretched farther than the eye could see. Beyond the rolling hills stood the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains, silent and unchanging, watching over the hard-working men and women who had built their lives on the frontier. The air smelled of fresh earth, pine trees, and cattle. Meadowlarks sang from weathered fence posts while a cool breeze carried the distant sound of lowing cows across the valley. This was home to Elias Turner. At 36 years old, Elias had earned a reputation few men could claim. He wasn't the richest rancher in Montana, nor the most powerful, but almost everyone agreed on one thing. His word was as dependable as the sunrise. If Elias Turner shook your hand, the deal was settled. If he promised to help, he would arrive before anyone else. If someone was hungry during a harsh winter, they often found a sack of flour or a side of beef mysteriously left on their porch before dawn. Few people knew those gifts always came from Turner Ranch. Elias preferred serving quietly. Every morning began the same way. Long before the ranch hands climbed from their bunks, Elias stepped onto his front porch carrying a worn leather Bible. The wood beneath his boots creaked softly as he settled into the old rocking chair his father had built decades earlier. He opened to the book of Psalms. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." He read slowly, letting every word settle into his heart. After closing the Bible, he removed his hat. "Father," he prayed quietly, "thank you for another day. Give me wisdom to care for this ranch, kindness toward everyone who works beside me, and courage to do what is right even when it costs me. If it is your will, bring someone to share this life with." It was the same prayer he had whispered for years. Not because he feared being alone. Because he believed God created family as one of his greatest gifts. He simply hadn't found the woman meant to build one with him. As the first rays of sunlight reached the valley, ranch hands emerged from the bunkhouse. "Morning, Mr. Turner," one called. "Morning, Ben." Another tipped his hat. "The south fence held after last night's storm. Good work. Let's check it together after breakfast." Elias never barked orders. He worked beside his men. He mended fences with them. He branded calves with them. He slept only after every horse had been fed and every worker had eaten. That was why his ranch hands remained loyal even when neighboring ranches offered higher wages. Respect could not be bought. It had to be earned. Yet while Turner Ranch prospered through honesty, another ranch several miles away flourished through fear. Silas Mercer stood on the balcony of his enormous ranch house overlooking thousands of acres. Unlike Elias, Silas measured success in ownership. More land. More cattle. More influence. He believed kindness was weakness. Mercy was expensive. Faith belonged only inside church buildings. Business, he often said, belonged to ruthless men. Silas stared across the valley through a brass telescope. In the distance he could see the green pastures surrounding Turner Ranch. At the center flowed something far more valuable than cattle. A spring. Clear, fresh water poured from beneath rocky hills year-round, even during drought. While neighboring streams dried every summer, the Turner Spring continued flowing. It was the secret behind Elias's healthy cattle. Silas wanted it more than anything. Over the past 5 years he had offered increasingly outrageous sums of money. Each offer had been refused. His latest proposal had been nearly double the ranch's value. Elias simply smiled. "My parents built this place with prayer and sacrifice. It isn't for sale." Silas had ridden away that afternoon furious. Now, leaning against the balcony rail, his jaw tightened once again. "You'll sell eventually," he muttered. "Everyone has a price." Behind him appeared his foreman, Clyde Benton, a broad-shouldered man whose loyalty depended entirely on whoever paid him the most. "You asked to see me." Silas turned. "Any news?" Clyde grinned. "Actually, yes. I heard Turner finally signed up with the church's mail-order bride program." Silas raised an eyebrow. "So the lonely cowboy finally gave up waiting." "Seems so. When does she arrive?" "Next week." Silas slowly smiled. A dangerous smile. Sometimes God answered prayers. Other times wicked men tried to interfere with them. "I think," Silas said softly, "our friend deserves a different kind of bride." Clyde looked confused. Silas poured himself a cup of coffee before explaining. "The church matched him with a ranch woman from Kansas." "I know." I've already learned the name of the stagecoach coordinator handling her paperwork. Realization spread across Clyde's face. You mean? Silas nodded. Money changes many things. The foreman laughed. What sort of bride will he receive instead? Silas walked toward his desk. He opened a folder containing passenger applications. Several had been rejected for various reasons. One caught his attention. Naomi Ellis. Widow. Age 28. Limited financial resources. Childhood injury resulting in a permanent limp. No living family. Requested placement anywhere willing to receive her. Silas chuckled. This one. Clyde frowned. She doesn't look dangerous. Exactly. Silas tapped the page. She's small. She limps. She's poor. The whole town will assume she's useless. He leaned back. Turner doesn't need a cruel wife. He needs one everyone believes is a burden. The two men laughed. Neither realized heaven often works through what the world overlooks. Several hundred miles away, inside a modest boarding house in St. Louis, Missouri, Naomi Ellis carefully folded the last of her belongings. Her room was scarcely larger than a pantry. A narrow bed stood against one wall. A wash basin rested beneath the single window. Beside the door sat a weathered wooden suitcase held together by leather straps that had been repaired more than once. On the small table rested another object she valued far more. A plain wooden box. She gently brushed away the dust with the sleeve of her faded blue dress before lifting the lid. Inside lay dozens of notebooks, each wrapped carefully in cloth to protect them from moisture. They had belonged to her father. Most people would have seen only worn journals filled with faded handwriting. Naomi saw treasure. As a little girl, she had spent countless evenings sitting beside her father while he recorded every detail about his cattle. Weights, feed mixtures, bloodlines, calving seasons, weather patterns, diseases, recovery methods. He had written everything. When neighbors laughed at his endless note-taking, he simply smiled. God gave us minds to learn, he would tell Naomi. Good stewardship means paying attention. After his death, creditors took nearly everything the family owned. The house, the livestock, the land. But they ignored the notebooks. To them they were worthless. To Naomi, they were her father's greatest inheritance. She gently opened the first journal. Inside the cover was a familiar verse written in careful handwriting. Commit thy works unto the Lord, and thy thoughts shall be established. Her fingers rested on the words. I miss you, Papa, she whispered. A tear escaped despite her efforts. Life since his death had not been kind. Her husband, Samuel, had died of pneumonia less than 2 years after they married. She had worked as a seamstress, a cook, a laundress, anything honest. Still, work became harder because of the limp left behind by a wagon accident when she was 12 years old. Many employers assumed she could not work. Many men assumed no one would marry a woman who walked differently. Eventually, the pastor of her church suggested the mail-order bride program. At first, Naomi refused. She did not want charity. Nor did she wish to become someone's obligation. But after months of prayer, she finally wrote a letter. Not asking for rescue. Simply asking God to lead her wherever she could still be useful. She had exchanged several kind letters with a rancher named Elias Turner. His words had stood apart from every other letter. He spoke often about faith, about responsibility, about building a home instead of merely owning a house. He never once asked whether her limp slowed her work. Instead, he asked what scripture encouraged her most during difficult seasons. That question had surprised her. Perhaps, she thought, this man truly wished for a partner rather than a servant. She carefully placed the journals back into the wooden box. No matter where life took her, those notebooks would go too. Across town, however, a sealed envelope quietly changed hands. One filled with money. One containing altered travel papers. The dishonest stagecoach coordinator glanced around before slipping both into his coat pocket. The names had been switched. The original bride intended for Elias Turner would never reach Montana. Instead, Naomi Ellis would unknowingly board the stagecoach meant for another woman's future. No one but Silas Mercer and the coordinator knew the truth. Back in Montana, Elias spent the afternoon repairing a broken gate with Ben. You nervous? Ben asked with a grin. Elias looked up from his hammer. About what? Your bride arriving. Elias laughed. A little. You've never even met her. No. But I've prayed for her. Ben leaned against the fence. What if she isn't what you expected? Elias drove another nail into place before answering. Then I'll thank God anyway. Ben frowned. Really? Elias nodded. I've learned something over the years. God usually answers prayers better than I know how to ask them. Far away, Naomi climbed aboard the westbound stagecoach carrying only one suitcase, one wooden box, a heart full of uncertainty, and faith that the Lord was guiding every mile. She had no idea that powerful men believed she would become the instrument of one rancher's ruin. Neither did they know that the quiet widow they called worthless carried knowledge capable of changing the future of cattle ranching across Montana. The wheels began to turn. The horses pulled the coach westward. And with every mile, God quietly moved his plan forward, one that no amount of greed, deception, or human scheming could stop. The journey from Helena to Turner Ranch was quiet. The wagon rolled steadily over the dirt road while the late afternoon sun painted the Montana hills in warm shades of amber and gold. A gentle breeze carried the scent of sagebrush and pine through the open countryside. Naomi sat beside Elias on the wagon seat, folding and unfolding her gloved hands in her lap. Neither of them spoke much. Not because they had nothing to say. They were simply two strangers trying to understand the unexpected path God had placed before them. The silence never felt uncomfortable. Felt peaceful. Elias glanced toward her. I suppose you've traveled farther than anyone else who's ever come to my ranch. Naomi smiled faintly. Nearly 1,500 miles. That's quite a journey. It gave me plenty of time to pray. He chuckled softly. I did the same while waiting. She looked at him with surprise. You prayed? Every day. What did you ask? He kept his eyes on the horses. I asked the Lord to help me become the husband my wife deserved. Naomi blinked. No man had ever answered a question like that. Most spoke about what they expected from a wife. Very few wondered what kind of husband they should become. She quietly looked toward the endless horizon. Perhaps she truly had arrived where God wanted her. Turner Ranch came into view just before sunset. The ranch house stood proudly on a gentle rise overlooking broad green pastures. Weathered barns, corrals, and bunkhouses surrounded the main home, while hundreds of cattle grazed peacefully across the rolling fields. Smoke curled from the stone chimney. The place felt alive. As the wagon approached, several ranch hands stopped their work to watch. Curiosity spread quickly. So that's the new bride. She's smaller than I expected. Doesn't look like she could carry a sack of grain. One man whispered, I heard she walks with a limp. Another answered, Poor Mr. Turner. Naomi heard every word. Years ago, those whispers would have broken her heart. Now they simply reminded her to pray. Lord, she whispered silently, help me answer criticism with kindness. Elias climbed down first before offering his hand. She accepted it gratefully. Welcome home. Home. The word caught her by surprise. No place had felt like home since her father's death. She stepped carefully onto the ground. Her injured leg protested after the long ride, but she refused to complain. Inside the ranch house, everything was simple but welcoming. The floors were scrubbed clean. Fresh bread cooled on the kitchen table. Wildflowers rested inside a mason jar near the window. Naomi smiled. You baked. Elias rubbed the back of his neck. I tried. She looked toward the loaf. It appears the bread survived. He laughed. Barely. For the first time since arriving, Naomi laughed too. The sound filled the quiet kitchen. Outside, one ranch hand smiled. Haven't heard the boss laugh like that in years. The following morning began before sunrise. Naomi woke early, dressed quietly, and walked carefully downstairs. She found Elias already reading his Bible beside the kitchen window. He looked up. I hope I didn't wake you. You didn't. She noticed the open Bible. Do you always begin your mornings that way? Every morning. He hesitated. Would you mind praying with me? She smiled warmly. I'd like that. They knelt together. Not as strangers. Not yet as husband and wife deeply in love. But as two believers asking God to bless the life now unfolding before them. When they finished praying, Elias stood. Breakfast first. Then I'll show you around the ranch. The tour lasted most of the morning. Naomi admired everything. The horse barn. The hayfields. The grazing pastures. The spring that supplied fresh water throughout the property. Finally they reached the cattle pens. Hundreds of cows moved slowly together. Naomi watched silently. Very silently. Elias noticed. What are you thinking? She hesitated. I probably shouldn't say. Why not? I've only just arrived. He smiled. I asked. She studied the herd again. Those 3 cows shouldn't remain together. He looked puzzled. Which 3? She pointed. The red cow near the fence. the black one behind her. And the spotted one. They're expecting calves. Yes. They're all too close together. Elias frowned. What makes you think so? The way they're standing. The red cow is uncomfortable. The spotted one keeps shifting her weight. The black cow has begun separating herself. He looked again. To him they appeared perfectly normal. Before he could respond, an older ranch hand approached. "Morning, Mr. Turner." "Mornin', Pete." Pete followed Naomi's gaze. His eyes widened. "Well, I'll be." Elias looked at him. "What?" Pete scratched his beard. "She's right. Those three'll calve inside a week." Naomi looked embarrassed. "I hope I wasn't speaking out of turn." Pete smiled. "Ma'am? I've worked cattle 30 years. It took me 5 minutes to notice. You saw it in 30 seconds. Throughout the next several days Naomi settled into ranch life. She quickly learned which jobs her injured leg could handle, and which ones it couldn't. She tried carrying water buckets. Her leg gave out halfway. She attempted lifting feed sacks. They were simply too heavy. She volunteered to help repair fencing. The uneven ground caused her too much pain. Each failure hurt. Not physically, emotionally. Late one afternoon she sat alone behind the barn, wiping tears before anyone could see them. "I wanted to help," she whispered. "I don't want to become a burden." A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "You aren't." She turned. Elias stood several feet away. "I wasn't spying. I came looking for you." She quickly brushed away the tears. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "I can't do the work everyone expected." Elias sat beside her on an old log. "Naomi, when I asked the Lord for a wife, I wasn't asking him for another ranch hand." She looked down. "I know people expected someone stronger. I don't." She looked at him. "You don't?" "I need someone who'll help build a home. I've already got plenty of men who can throw hay." His words settled gently into her wounded heart. For years she had believed usefulness meant physical strength. Maybe, just maybe, God measured people differently. Naomi found her place naturally. She organized the pantry. She repaired torn work shirts. She baked fresh bread every morning. She kept accurate household accounts. Within a week, the kitchen ran more smoothly than it ever had. The ranch hands noticed. Meals appeared on time. Supplies never ran short. Nothing went to waste. One evening Ben commented, "I don't know how she does it." Pete nodded. "The place feels different." Neither realized Naomi had spent years managing every penny after losing her husband. Order came naturally to her. A few days later, Elias entered the house carrying several dusty ledgers. He sighed heavily. "I've fallen behind again." "What are those?" "Cattle records. I've always hated bookkeeping." He dropped the heavy books onto the dining table. Numbers filled every page. Birth records, sales, breeding notes, feed costs, vaccinations. Naomi looked through them carefully. "May I?" "Of course." She spent nearly an hour reading without speaking. Finally she looked up. "Your records are honest." He smiled. "I suppose that's good. But they're incomplete." His eyebrows lifted. "Incomplete? You record sales. But not bloodlines. You count calves. But don't compare which breeding pairs produce the healthiest offspring." She turned another page. "You've lost 12 calves in 3 years." "Yes. Most during late winter." She paused thoughtfully. "Have you noticed they're all descendants of the same bull?" Elias stared. "No. You saw that already?" She nodded. It stood out. He leaned forward. "Naomi, where did you learn all this?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked toward the staircase. "I'd like to show you something." She climbed slowly upstairs before returning with the small wooden box. Elias recognized it immediately. She had guarded it carefully throughout the entire journey. He had assumed it contained family keepsakes. In a way, it did. She placed it gently on the table. The old hinges creaked softly as she opened the lid. Inside rested dozens of worn journals wrapped carefully in cloth. She lifted one with almost reverent hands. "My father's. You've mentioned him. He believed every animal had something to teach us." She handed Elias the first notebook. Inside were pages of neat handwriting. Dates, measurements, family trees of cattle stretching back decades, feed experiments, weather observations, detailed sketches, even scripture verses written beside difficult seasons. Elias slowly turned page after page. His eyes grew wider. "This is incredible." Naomi smiled. Papa recorded everything. When neighbors laughed, he simply kept writing. She opened another journal. This one compares pasture grasses. And this one tracks calving seasons. She reached for a third. This one explains how certain breeding lines survive harder winters. Elias looked at her in amazement. You studied all of this? Every evening after chores. He said learning was part of honoring God's creation. She lowered her eyes. But after he died, no one cared what I knew. They only saw a woman. And later, a widow with a limp. Silence filled the room. Elias carefully closed the notebook. Then he looked directly into her eyes. They were blind. She blinked. What? They saw your limp. They missed your gift. He picked up another journal. Naomi. These notes aren't ordinary. They're years ahead of anything I've ever seen. She looked almost embarrassed. I never thought anyone would want them. I do. He smiled. And I have a feeling. Our cattle will too. For the first time in many years, Naomi felt that the knowledge her father had poured into her life had not been forgotten. God had simply been waiting for the right place, the right time, and the right man who would recognize the treasure everyone else had overlooked. Outside the dining room window, the sun slowly disappeared behind the Montana hills. Inside the Turner home, something far more important than a marriage was beginning. A partnership. One built not on pride, but on trust. Not on appearances, but on God-given purpose. Neither Elias nor Naomi realized that the old notebooks resting on the table would soon transform Turner Ranch in ways no one, not even Silas Mercer, could have imagined. The first signs of spring arrived quietly across the Montana Valley. Snow still clung to the distant mountain peaks, but the lower hills were turning green once again. Wildflowers pushed through the thawing earth, and calves could be seen wobbling beside their mothers on unsteady legs. Life was returning to the frontier. At Turner Ranch, every sunrise began the same way. Before the ranch hands gathered for breakfast, Elias and Naomi met in the kitchen. The coffee pot simmered over the stove while fresh biscuits baked in the oven. Their Bibles rested side by side on the worn wooden table. Elias smiled as Naomi finished reading aloud. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. She gently closed the Bible. I think your father would have liked that verse. Naomi smiled. He quoted it often. Elias bowed his head. Would you pray this morning? She nodded. Heavenly Father, thank you for another day you've given us. Help us care for this ranch with honesty, treat every person with kindness, and remember that everything we own already belongs to you. Give us humble hearts that listen before speaking and courage to do what is right, even when others disagree. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen, Elias replied. The simple routine became the foundation of their marriage. Before they planned their work, they first sought God's direction. Later that morning, Elias carried several of Naomi's father's notebooks into the ranch office. Ben, Pete, and two other ranch hands looked curiously at the stack of worn journals. Pete scratched his beard. Those old books again? Elias smiled. They've got more wisdom than half the ranchers in Montana. Ben laughed. Can books really teach cattle anything? Before Elias could answer, Naomi entered carrying fresh coffee. I don't think the books teach the cattle, she said gently. They teach us. The men chuckled politely. Not mockingly, but skeptically. Naomi understood. Knowledge often sounded strange before people saw the results. She placed one notebook on the desk and opened it carefully. My father discovered something many years ago. The men gathered closer. If you continue breeding the same bloodlines without careful planning, the calves gradually become weaker. Pete frowned. We've always kept the strongest bull. Strength matters, Naomi replied. But so does balance. She pointed toward a carefully drawn chart. My father tracked cattle for nearly 20 years. He noticed that calves from unrelated healthy bloodlines survived winters more often. Ben folded his arms. So you're saying we've been doing it wrong? Naomi smiled kindly. I'm saying perhaps we can do it better. No one spoke. The room fell quiet. Finally Elias broke the silence. We're trying it. One of the younger ranch hands looked uncertain. That's a mighty big change. It is. But every improvement begins with someone willing to learn. Over the following weeks, the ranch slowly adopted Naomi's suggestions. Every cow received an individual record. Birth dates, parents, health, weight, temperament, calving history. Instead of simply counting cattle, they began understanding them. Naomi created organized ledgers unlike anything the ranch had ever used. Even the bunkhouse conversations changed. One evening Ben looked over the records. "I never realized old Daisy's calves always gain weight faster." Pete nodded. "Or that Molly calves nearly a week earlier every spring." Naomi smiled from across the room. "When you keep good records, patterns begin to speak." Pete laughed. "I reckon your father was a smart fellow." He was. He also believed God hides order inside creation. Not everyone welcomed the changes. One afternoon a ranch hand named Curtis tossed his pencil onto the table. "This paperwork's wasting time. I'd rather be writing." Naomi looked up calmly. "I understand." He sighed. "My father never needed books." "No," she answered softly. "But he also lost nearly 30 calves during the winter of '79. Curtis blinked. "How'd you know that?" "My husband told me." She smiled gently. "I'm not criticizing your father. I'm trying to help us avoid repeating painful lessons." Curtis looked away. He had no reply. A month later the first challenge arrived. One of the pregnant cows struggled through a difficult labor. Several ranch hands gathered nervously inside the barn. Pete wiped sweat from his forehead. "I've never seen a calf position like this." Another man muttered, "We're going to lose both." Naomi quietly stepped closer. "May I look?" The men exchanged uncertain glances. Curtis whispered, "She's never delivered a calf." Naomi knelt beside the frightened animal. Carefully she examined the situation exactly as her father had once taught her. Then she stood. "The calf's front leg is folded underneath." Pete frowned. "Can you tell?" She nodded. "My father dealt with this twice." She calmly explained what needed to be done. Pete followed every instruction. Slowly, carefully. Minutes later, a healthy calf slid safely onto the straw. The barn fell silent. Then came the sound everyone had hoped to hear. A loud, healthy cry. The exhausted mother immediately began licking her newborn. Pete removed his hat. "I'll be." Curtis stared in disbelief. "How did you know?" Naomi smiled. "I watched my father. And I paid attention." Pete shook his head. "No. You did more than pay attention. You learned." Word spread across the ranch before sunset. The boss's wife had saved both cow and calf. The whispers changed. Not overnight, but noticeably. Instead of saying, "She can't help," people began saying, "Ask Mrs. Turner." As weeks passed, remarkable things continued happening. Calves gained weight faster. Fewer animals became sick. The breeding records began confirming exactly what Naomi's father had written years earlier. Elias sat one evening comparing numbers from previous years. He looked up with amazement. "Naomi." She looked over from the sewing basket. "Yes. Our calf survival rate has improved nearly 15% already." She smiled. "That's wonderful. You don't sound surprised." "I'm not. My father always said healthy planning produces healthy generations." Elias laughed. "I think your father was wiser than most professors." She smiled toward the old wooden box sitting quietly in the corner. "He always gave God the credit." News traveled quickly between neighboring ranches. At the general store, ranchers gathered around the potbelly stove discussing the unusual reports. "I heard Turner hasn't lost a calf all month. They're separating breeding stock now. They're weighing cattle every week." One man laughed. "That's his wife's doing." Another scoffed. "A woman doesn't know more than lifelong ranchers." Standing nearby, Silas Mercer quietly listened. His expression darkened. Something wasn't happening according to plan. He had expected Elias to become overwhelmed caring for an inexperienced wife. Instead, Turner Ranch appeared to be improving. He looked toward Clyde. "Find out what's going on. I want every detail." The following Sunday the entire valley gathered for church. Families arrived by wagon from miles away. Children laughed outside while women greeted one another beneath the shade of cottonwood trees. As Naomi entered beside Elias, conversations briefly paused. Only weeks earlier many of these same people had whispered behind her back. Now their expressions carried curiosity instead of pity. Mrs. Hargrove, who had once questioned whether Naomi could survive ranch life, approached carefully. "Mrs. Turner?" Naomi smiled warmly. "Good morning. I wanted to thank you." Naomi looked surprised. "For what?" "My youngest milk cow became ill. I tried the herb mixture you suggested. She's completely recovered. I'm so grateful." Naomi squeezed her hand. "I'm thankful she's well." Mrs. Hargrove hesitated. I owe you an apology too. Naomi looked at her gently. You don't owe me anything. I judged you before knowing you. Naomi smiled with genuine kindness. We've all made that mistake. There isn't much use carrying yesterday's pride into tomorrow. Tears filled the older woman's eyes. You truly are a gracious woman. Naomi simply answered. God has been gracious to me. Elias watched from a short distance. His heart filled with quiet admiration. Forgiveness came naturally to Naomi. Not because she was weak. Because she understood how much she herself had been forgiven. That afternoon they walked home after church. The Montana breeze stirred the tall grass around them. For several minutes neither spoke. Finally Elias broke the silence. May I tell you something? She looked up. Of course. I've been thinking. About what? The day you arrived. She smiled. I remember. So do I. He laughed softly. I remember hearing everyone whisper. So did I. I almost felt angry. Naomi looked at him. Why? Because they judged someone they didn't know. She smiled gently. I've learned something. What? People often judge what they can see. But God sees what He's creating. Elias nodded slowly. I think. He knew exactly who this ranch needed. She lowered her eyes, slightly embarrassed. I don't know about that. I do. He stopped walking. Turning toward her, he spoke quietly. When I first asked the Lord for a wife, I imagined someone who could ride beside me all day. He smiled warmly. Instead, He sent someone who taught me how much more valuable wisdom is than appearances. Naomi's eyes glistened. I've spent years believing I had little to offer. Elias gently took her hand. I don't believe God ever wastes His gifts. You carried yours all the way from Missouri inside that wooden box. They stood together as the evening sun settled behind the mountains. Neither noticed a rider watching from a distant hill. Silas Mercer's spy lowered his field glasses before turning his horse back toward Mercer Ranch. By nightfall, Silas would receive news he never expected. The bride he had chosen because he believed she was useless was becoming the greatest strength Turner Ranch had ever known. His plan was failing. And desperate men often become dangerous when their schemes begin to unravel. Summer settled over the Montana Territory with long warm days and cool evenings that carried the scent of pine and fresh-cut hay. Turner Ranch had never looked healthier. The pastures were thick with green grass. Calves that had been born during the spring now raced across the fields with surprising strength. Even the older ranch hands admitted they had never seen such a promising herd. One evening, as the day's work came to an end, Pete leaned against a corral fence while watching the cattle. He shook his head with a grin. I've been ranching 32 years. Ben looked over. And? I've never seen calves put on weight this quickly. Curtis nodded in agreement. Neither have I. Pete chuckled. I guess Mrs. Turner's father knew what he was talking about. Across the corral, Naomi was updating the breeding ledger while Elias checked the evening feed. She smiled as another healthy calf nudged its mother. That's number 47, she said. Elias looked over. What is? The 47th calf born this season. And everyone survived. Elias stopped writing. Everyone. Not one stillbirth. Not one abandoned calf. Not one mysterious illness. He quietly removed his hat. Lord, he whispered, thank you. Naomi looked at him and smiled. She knew exactly why he had stopped. Success had never made Elias proud. It always made him grateful. The following week, cattle buyers began arriving from neighboring counties. Word had spread farther than either Elias or Naomi realized. The Turner herd was healthier, stronger, calmer. Several buyers walked slowly through the breeding pens, carefully examining the young bulls. One buyer finally spoke. I've heard stories. They're true. Another nodded. I'll take 6 breeding bulls. A third raised his hand. I'll buy 8. Elias looked surprised. Gentlemen, I appreciate your confidence. But I'm afraid I can't sell that many. The men exchanged puzzled looks. You don't have enough? I do. But if I sell too many of my best bloodlines at once, I'll weaken next year's herd. One rancher laughed. You'd rather earn less money? Elias smiled. I'd rather build something that lasts. The buyers respected the answer. Before sunset, every available breeding contract for the coming year had already been reserved. Inside the ranch house that evening, Naomi carefully entered each sale into the ledger. Elias looked over her shoulder. I've never seen demand like this. She smiled. Healthy animals speak for themselves. Then her smile faded. Success also attracts attention. He noticed the concern in her voice. What are you thinking? She closed the ledger. I'm thinking Mr. Mercer won't ignore this forever. Several miles away, Silas Mercer sat inside his office staring at the latest cattle reports. His jaw tightened with every page. Sales increasing. Health improving. Buyers waiting months for Turner breeding stock. Finally he slammed the papers onto his desk. This wasn't supposed to happen. Clyde stood nearby. We've confirmed it's the wife. Silas looked up sharply. What about her? She keeps detailed breeding records. Every calf. Every cow. Every bloodline. Silas stood and paced the room. A woman. He laughed bitterly. All this trouble? Because of one woman. He stopped beside the window. No. This ends now. Clyde understood immediately. What do you want done? Silas spoke calmly. Nothing that points back to us. But accidents happen on ranches. He smiled coldly. Especially at night. 3 nights later, the moon hid behind thick clouds. Only the sound of crickets and distant coyotes broke the silence. Near midnight, 3 riders approached Turner Ranch from the north. Their horses wore cloth around their hooves to muffle the sound. The men worked quickly. One cut through several fence lines. Another quietly opened 2 pasture gates. The third poured a strange liquid into one of the watering troughs before they disappeared into the darkness. Before sunrise, chaos erupted. Ben burst through the front door. Mr. Turner? Elias was already awake. What happened? The north fence is down. Cattle are everywhere. Elias grabbed his hat. I'm coming. Outside, ranch hands were already saddling horses. Naomi followed them onto the porch. How many escaped? Pete answered while tightening his saddle. Maybe 60. Elias looked toward Naomi. Stay here. She nodded. I'll pray. Within minutes the riders disappeared across the hills. For the next 8 hours they searched every pasture, creek, and valley. Some cattle were recovered quickly. Others wandered miles away. By late afternoon most had returned safely. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Until Pete noticed something else. Mr. Turner? Elias walked over. What is it? Pete pointed toward one of the watering troughs. 3 cows lay nearby, barely moving. Naomi hurried over despite the pain in her leg. She knelt beside one of the animals. Its breathing was shallow. Its eyes struggled to stay open. She examined the water. Then she smelled it. Her expression changed. This isn't natural. Elias looked down. What do you mean? Someone put something in the trough. Pete stared. You think somebody poisoned them? Naomi nodded slowly. I do. Immediately every remaining animal was moved away from the water. Fresh buckets were brought from the spring. By God's mercy, only 3 cows had drunk enough to become ill. Working together, Naomi and Pete treated them through the night using every remedy they knew. By dawn, all 3 survived. The ranch gathered around the breakfast table the next morning. No one had slept much. Curtis finally broke the silence. This wasn't an accident. No, Elias agreed. It wasn't. Ben looked worried. Who would do something like this? No one answered. But everyone thought the same name. Silas Mercer. Without evidence, however, there was nothing they could prove. Over the next 2 weeks, more strange incidents occurred. A saddle disappeared. Tools went missing. Several gates were mysteriously left open. One evening Ben found fresh boot prints near the breeding pasture. Curtis muttered, Someone keeps coming onto this ranch. Elias frowned. But how do they always know where we'll be? That question stayed with Naomi. She said nothing. Instead, she began watching, listening, taking notes, just as her father had taught her. Something happened once. Might be chance. Twice. It deserved attention. 3 times. There was a pattern. Naomi spread several sheets of paper across the dining table late one evening. Elias looked over. What are those? She pointed carefully. The night the north fence was cut. She marked a spot. The day your saddle disappeared. Another mark. The poison trough. Then another. The missing tools. Elias studied the pages. I don't understand. She handed him the ranch calendar. Look closer. He compared the dates. His eyes narrowed. They're all. She finished the sentence. The day after supply deliveries from town. Silence filled the room. Then Elias slowly looked up. Someone knows our schedule. Naomi nodded. And only a handful of people know exactly when deliveries arrive. He sat back. You think we have someone telling Mercer? I think someone is telling somebody. She paused. I don't know whether it's intentional, but information is leaving this ranch. The following week Elias quietly changed the delivery schedule. He told each ranch hand something different. To Ben he said the wagon would arrive Monday. To Curtis Wednesday. To Pete Friday. Only Naomi knew the actual delivery would arrive Thursday. Thursday morning came peacefully. Nothing happened. Friday night. The south fence was cut. Elias looked at Naomi. She didn't smile. She simply lowered her eyes. It was the Friday story. Only Pete had been told Friday. Elias shook his head. No. Pete would never betray them. Then they remembered. Pete had mentioned the schedule during lunch, while another ranch hand had been standing nearby. A young employee named Owen. Quiet. Friendly. Always asking questions. Too many questions. That evening Elias asked Owen to meet him in the barn. The young man entered nervously. You wanted to see me? Elias nodded. I did. He closed the barn door gently. No shouting. No anger. I simply want the truth. Owen looked confused. What truth? Naomi stepped forward carrying the calendar. You've been sharing information. His face immediately lost color. We changed everyone's schedules. The attack happened only after the day you heard. Silence. Long silence. Then tears filled Owen's eyes. I'm sorry. He dropped onto a hay bale, covering his face. I didn't know they'd poison animals. Elias remained calm. Who? Owen swallowed hard. Clyde Benton. He paid me. I only told him when supplies were coming. I thought. His voice broke. I thought they just wanted to compete. Naomi quietly handed him a cup of water. You've been carrying this guilt for weeks. He nodded. I couldn't sleep. I knew I was wrong. I just kept telling myself I'd stop after one more time. Elias remembered his own failures before Christ had changed his heart. He spoke gently. Thank you for telling the truth. Owen looked up in surprise. Aren't you angry? I am disappointed. But disappointment isn't the same as hatred. Naomi added softly. Confession is the first step toward restoration. The young man began crying openly. I'll leave. You'll never see me again. Elias looked toward Naomi. She gave a small nod. He turned back. You will leave. Owen lowered his head. But not forever. The young man blinked. What? You'll spend time making things right. If your repentance is genuine, there may still be a place for you here someday. Owen could hardly believe what he was hearing. Mercy. He expected revenge. Instead, he received grace. The following Sunday, Owen stood before the church congregation. With trembling hands he confessed everything. He admitted accepting money. He admitted betraying the Turners' trust. He asked for forgiveness. Many people wept. The pastor placed a hand on his shoulder. Sin always has consequences. But so does repentance. Elias stepped forward. I forgive him. The congregation fell silent. Naomi joined her husband. So do I. Across the room, several men lowered their heads in shame. If they had suffered such betrayal, would they have shown the same mercy? Late that evening, Elias and Naomi sat together on the porch watching the stars appear one by one above the Montana sky. The ranch was quiet once again. After several minutes, Elias spoke. I've been thinking. About Owen? He nodded. I wanted justice. So did I. But I think God wanted something greater. She smiled softly. Redemption. He smiled back. Exactly. Naomi reached for his hand. We still haven't stopped Mr. Mercer. No. But we've stopped him from turning us into people we don't want to become. Elias looked across the moonlit pastures where their cattle rested peacefully. The battle for Turner Ranch was far from over. Silas Mercer had lost another scheme. His spy had confessed. His sabotage had failed. And every setback only made his bitterness grow stronger. In the shadows of his own ranch house, Silas stared toward the distant lights of Turner Ranch. His eyes burned with anger. If I can't destroy the ranch, he clenched his fists, I'll destroy everything they love. The greatest trial of Elias and Naomi's lives was still ahead. Autumn arrived quietly across the Montana territory. The golden grasses that had danced beneath the summer sun slowly turned shades of amber and bronze. Cottonwood leaves drifted gently through the cool morning air, covering the ranch roads like a patchwork quilt. The days grew shorter. The nights became colder. For most ranchers, that simply meant another winter was coming. For Naomi, It meant it was time to prepare. One crisp morning, she stood on a hill overlooking the grazing pastures with Elias beside her. The cattle grazed peacefully below. She remained silent for several moments before speaking. "I've been thinking about my father's journals." Elias smiled. "You usually are." She laughed softly. "He always said winter wasn't survived in December." Elias looked at her. "When was it survived?" "In September." He frowned thoughtfully. "I don't understand." "My father believed winter is won by the choices we make before it arrives." She opened one of the worn notebooks she had carried from Missouri. Several pages had been marked with small pieces of cloth. She pointed to one section. "He kept records for 27 winters." Elias leaned closer. He noticed something. "What?" "The ranchers who lost the fewest cattle weren't always the richest. They were simply the ones who prepared earliest." She looked across the valley. "I think this winter will be harder than usual." Elias trusted her judgment. "What do we need?" Naomi began turning pages. "We need more hay. Much more. We should repair every shelter before the first snow. We need to dig drainage channels near the spring. And," she paused, "we should move the pregnant cows closer to the barns." Elias nodded. "We'll start today." Not everyone agreed. That afternoon, the ranch hands gathered inside the equipment barn while Elias explained the new plan. Ben listened carefully. Pete nodded along. But Curtis frowned. "Twice as much hay? That's expensive." Another ranch hand added, "We've never needed that much before." Naomi stood quietly near the doorway. She wasn't offended by their questions. Good workers deserved honest answers. She stepped forward. "My father used to say something." The room grew still. "He said preparing for a storm always looks foolish on a sunny day." Pete smiled. "Sounds like a wise man." Curtis still looked uncertain. "What if winter isn't bad?" Naomi smiled kindly. "Then we'll have extra hay." "But if winter is worse than expected?" She looked around the room. "Our cattle will eat while others go hungry." Silence filled the barn. Finally Elias spoke. "We're following the plan." No one argued again. For the next 2 months, Turner Ranch worked harder than ever before. Every hand joined the effort. Hay fields were harvested until sunset. New storage barns were built. Broken fences were repaired. Additional wells were cleaned. Wood was stacked high beside every building. Naomi reorganized the feed storage so older supplies would be used first. Nothing was wasted. She also created something entirely new. Every animal received a winter care schedule. Which pasture they would use. How much feed they required. Which cows were expecting calves. Which older animals needed extra shelter. Pete stared at the charts one evening. "I've never seen anything like this." Naomi smiled. "My father always believed confusion costs lives." One afternoon, a neighboring rancher named Thomas Wilkins rode onto Turner Ranch. His horse looked tired. So did he. "Elias. It's good to see you." Thomas removed his hat. "I've heard you've been buying hay from every farmer in the county." Elias nodded. "We have." Thomas chuckled. "You expecting 10 winters instead of 1? Naomi stepped onto the porch carrying fresh coffee. Thomas tipped his hat politely. "Mrs. Turner." She smiled warmly. "Good afternoon." Thomas looked toward the growing hay stacks. "You really think we'll need all that?" Naomi answered honestly. "I don't know. But I'd rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it." Thomas laughed. "I suppose that's true. Still." As he rode away, he quietly shook his head. Turner Ranch was preparing far more than anyone thought necessary. Many believed Elias was wasting money. Some even whispered that Naomi's careful planning had made him overly cautious. Neither of them answered the criticism. They simply kept working. Late one evening, after the ranch hands had gone to bed, Elias found Naomi sitting beside the fireplace. One of her father's journals rested open on her lap. She looked troubled. "What are you reading?" She turned the book toward him. "My father's entry from October of 1878. He sat beside her. "What happened?" She read quietly. "The sky has been strangely still for several days. The birds have begun leaving earlier than usual. The cattle remain unusually close together at night. I believe a severe winter is coming." She looked up. He was right. How bad was it? He lost friends. Entire herds disappeared. She closed the journal slowly. "I'm seeing the same signs." Elias placed his hand gently over hers. "We've done everything we can." She nodded. "Now we trust God." The first snowfall arrived in early November. Within a week, temperatures dropped lower than anyone expected. By December, the storm came. The wind screamed across the open prairie with frightening force. Snow buried fences. Roads disappeared beneath towering drifts. The sky remained gray for days. Then weeks. The cold became relentless. One morning, Ben struggled through waist-deep snow to the ranch house. Elias. He burst through the door. The north shelter roof collapsed. Without hesitation, every man grabbed coats and ropes. Naomi wrapped blankets around kettles of hot coffee. I'll have warm food ready when you return. Outside, the wind nearly knocked them from their horses. Visibility dropped to only a few yards. Yet because the shelters had been reinforced months earlier, only one small section collapsed. The cattle remained safe. Across the valley, the story was very different. Neighboring ranches began losing animals every day. Hay supplies disappeared quickly. Frozen water left cattle weak. Many ranchers simply weren't prepared. One evening, Thomas Wilkins arrived again. This time, his eyes were filled with fear. Elias. His voice trembled. I'm out of feed. Elias looked toward Naomi. Neither needed to speak. Thomas continued. If I don't find hay, I'll lose nearly everything. Elias walked toward the barn. Come with me. Thomas stared in disbelief as enormous stacks of hay filled the storage building. You actually prepared. Elias smiled. My wife did. Thomas looked at Naomi. I don't have enough money. She answered immediately. We didn't ask for money. He looked confused. What? She smiled gently. Take what your cattle need. Thomas's eyes filled with tears. I can't accept that. Elias placed a hand on his shoulder. You can. And you will. Thomas lowered his head. I'll repay every bale. Elias smiled. If the Lord blesses you enough to do that someday? Wonderful. If not. He looked toward the snow-covered valley. Help someone else when it's their turn. Thomas rode home weeping. Not because of the hay. Because someone had chosen generosity over profit. Within days, more ranchers came. The Harris family. Old Mr. Donnelly. Young Samuel Briggs, who had only started ranching the previous spring. Each expected to buy feed. Instead, many received it freely. Ben quietly approached Elias. We're giving away a lot. We are. What if we run short ourselves? Naomi answered before Elias could. We counted. Ben looked puzzled. Counted? We prepared enough to share. Pete overheard the conversation. He smiled. That's exactly what Jesus would have done. The harsh winter continued into January. Blizzards came one after another. Several ranches lost nearly half their herds. Some lost everything. Turner Ranch continued working from dawn until long after dark. Every calf remained sheltered. Every water source stayed open. Every feeding schedule remained organized. The careful planning from autumn was now saving lives every single day. One freezing morning, Curtis stood looking across the healthy Turner herd. He quietly shook his head. I owe Mrs. Turner an apology. Pete grinned. For doubting her? Curtis nodded. I thought all those charts were a waste of time. He watched another group of cattle calmly eating. They've become the reason these animals are still alive. One Sunday, despite heavy snow, several neighboring families gathered inside the Turner barn for worship. The roads were impassable. The church building was too far away. So Elias opened the barn instead. Hay bales became pews. Lanterns hung from wooden beams. Children sat wrapped in blankets beside their parents. The pastor had been unable to travel. So Elias read from the scriptures. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Afterward, everyone sang softly together. Their voices echoed through the barn while snow fell outside. When the singing ended, Thomas stood. I want to say something. The room became quiet. He turned toward Naomi. Most of us thought you were a burden when you first arrived. Naomi looked down. Thomas continued. I was one of them. I judged you without knowing you. He swallowed hard. My cattle are alive because you prepared. My children still have hope because you convinced Elias to store extra hay. He removed his hat. Thank you. One by one, other ranchers stood. Some thanked Elias. Most thanked Naomi. She wiped away a tear before answering. If you want to thank someone? She looked toward heaven. Thank the Lord. My father taught me many things. But every bit of wisdom he had, he first received from God. The barn fell silent. Many bowed their heads. They realized they were witnessing more than good ranch management. They were seeing faithful stewardship. As February slowly gave way to March, the storms finally weakened. The snow began melting. Streams flowed again. Green shoots pushed through the frozen ground. The worst winter Montana had seen in decades was finally ending. One afternoon, Elias and Naomi rode slowly across their pastures. Healthy cattle grazed peacefully beneath the warming sun. Elias counted quietly. "We've lost only 3. Naomi closed her eyes. "Thank you, Lord." Across the valley, the losses were heartbreaking. Some ranchers had lost hundreds. Others had abandoned their ranches altogether. Word spread quickly across the territory. Turner Ranch had survived. Not by luck. Not by chance. But through wisdom, preparation, and unwavering faith. Soon, buyers from hundreds of miles away would begin arriving, eager to purchase breeding stock from the ranch whose cattle had endured the great winter better than any other. But while blessings were drawing near, so was danger. High on a distant ridge, Silas Mercer stared through his spyglass at the thriving Turner herd. His own cattle had not fared nearly as well. His losses were staggering. His anger burned hotter than ever. "They should have failed," he muttered. "They were supposed to lose everything." Instead, the people he had tried to destroy were becoming the most respected ranchers in Montana. And a bitter heart rarely accepts defeat without making one final, desperate attempt. Spring returned to Montana with the gentle certainty of God's promises. Snow melted from the mountain slopes, filling streams that sparkled beneath the warm sun. The valleys became green once more, and wildflowers covered the hillsides in shades of purple, yellow, and white. The long winter was over. Life had won again. At Turner Ranch, calves born during the harshest weeks of the storm now chased one another through the fresh grass while their mothers grazed peacefully nearby. The ranch had survived. More than survived. It had become stronger. One morning, Elias stood beside the corral with Ben and Pete, watching buyers inspect several young breeding bulls. Ben shook his head in amazement. "I've never seen so many wagons in one week." Pete smiled. "They've come from 3 territories now." Another buyer approached Elias. "Mr. Turner, I heard your herd came through the winter with almost no losses." "We were blessed. I'd like to reserve 4 breeding pairs." Elias smiled apologetically. "I'm afraid they're already spoken for." The buyer laughed. "I suppose I'll have to wait." "You'll be in good company." Before noon, every breeding contract for the coming year had been reserved. Ben quietly leaned toward Pete. "Remember when folks called Mrs. Turner useless?" Pete chuckled. "I remember. They aren't saying that anymore." Inside the ranch house, Naomi carefully updated the ranch ledger. She smiled as she entered another successful sale. The wooden box containing her father's journals rested on the shelf nearby. Every evening after finishing the day's work, she still opened one notebook. Not because she had forgotten its lessons, because she never wanted to stop learning. As she carefully turned another page, Elias entered carrying fresh mail from town. "There are letters for you." She looked surprised. "For me?" He handed her a small bundle. The first letter came from a young ranch wife in Wyoming. "Mrs. Turner, my husband says your breeding records saved our first herd. Would you consider writing more about your methods?" The second came from a church in Idaho asking if Naomi would share her father's ideas with struggling families. Another came from a widow who simply wrote, "Your story gave me hope that God still has a purpose for women others overlook." Naomi slowly folded the letters. "I don't know why they're writing to me." Elias smiled. "I do. You've helped people. I only shared what my father taught me. And what God taught your father." She looked toward the window. "I hope I never become proud." Elias answered gently. "I don't think that's something you need to worry about." Several miles away, Silas Mercer sat alone inside his office. The room that once echoed with confidence now felt strangely empty. A ledger lay open before him. The numbers told a painful story. Winter losses, broken contracts, declining profits, buyers choosing Turner Ranch instead of Mercer Ranch. Silas slammed the book shut. "This can't continue." Clyde stood silently nearby. "What now?" Silas stared out the window. "We should have ended this months ago." Clyde looked uneasy. The poisoning failed. The fence cutting failed. The spy confessed. Silas turned sharply. "Then perhaps someone else needs persuading." "What do you mean?" Silas walked toward the fireplace. "The stagecoach coordinator." Clyde's expression changed. "He knows everything." Silas nodded. "And frightened men sometimes start talking." That same afternoon in the town of Helena, the stagecoach coordinator sat alone behind his desk. His name was Walter Pierce. For months he had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he remembered accepting Silas Mercer's money. He remembered switching the travel documents. He remembered convincing himself that no real harm would come. It was only paperwork, he had repeated to himself. But now, he knew better. He had watched what happened afterward. He had seen Naomi and Elias build a life together. He had also heard whispers of poisoned cattle, sabotaged fences, stolen livestock. Every dishonest choice had grown into something darker. Walter removed his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes. A Bible rested in the corner of his desk. It had belonged to his late mother. For weeks he had ignored it. Today, he opened it. The page fell naturally to Proverbs. He that covereth his sins shall not prosper, but whoso confesseth and forsaketh them shall have mercy. Walter read the verse 3 times. Then he quietly bowed his head. Lord. His voice trembled. I've been a coward. I cannot change what I did. But I can tell the truth. The following Sunday after church services ended, Walter asked Pastor Samuel if he could speak privately. The pastor noticed the fear in his face. Of course. Inside the small church office, Walter confessed everything. Every detail. The bribe. The switched paperwork. The false records. The pastor listened without interruption. When Walter finally finished, tears rolled down his face. I've carried this long enough. Pastor Samuel remained silent for a moment. Then he asked, Have you told Elias Turner? Walter slowly shook his head. No. Then that's where repentance begins. 2 days later, a familiar wagon stopped outside Turner Ranch. Ben looked toward the road. I think that's the stagecoach coordinator. Elias stepped onto the porch. Walter climbed down slowly. His hands shook. Naomi joined Elias outside. She immediately noticed the sadness in the man's eyes. Can we help you? Walter removed his hat. I've come to ask forgiveness. No one spoke. He swallowed hard. I need to tell you the truth. They invited him inside. The kitchen became very still. Walter could barely meet their eyes. The bride who was originally matched with you? He looked toward Elias. Never received your letters. Elias frowned. What do you mean? I changed the records. Naomi's face grew pale. Walter continued. Silas Mercer paid me. He wanted your marriage to fail. He believed if you received someone the town considered weak, your ranch would collapse. Silence filled the room. Only the ticking of the old clock could be heard. Walter finally whispered, I'm the man who sent Naomi here. Naomi stared at the table. She had never imagined such a possibility. Elias asked quietly, So, the woman I expected? Walter nodded sadly. She married another rancher. And you? He looked toward Naomi. Were never meant to come to Montana. No one spoke for several long moments. Finally Walter stood. I don't expect forgiveness. I simply couldn't keep lying. He turned toward the door. Before he reached it, Elias spoke. Walter. The man stopped. Elias walked over slowly. Thank you. For finally telling the truth. Walter looked stunned. That's all? No. Elias smiled gently. I also forgive you. Walter blinked in disbelief. You do. I won't pretend what you did wasn't wrong. It changed both our lives. But carrying bitterness won't honor Christ. Walter covered his face as tears began falling. I don't deserve that. No. Elias answered softly. Neither do I. And yet God forgave me. Walter quietly wept. After he left, the house remained silent. Naomi stood by the window watching the wagon disappear down the road. Her thoughts raced. Finally she spoke. So. She struggled to find the words. I wasn't supposed to be here. Elias looked at her. According to men, she was right. According to heaven, perhaps not. Naomi turned toward him. If the records hadn't been changed, you would have married someone else. He remained quiet. She looked down. Would you have been happier? The question carried years of hidden pain. Every insult she had ever heard. Every whisper about being unwanted. Every moment she had believed she was less than others. Elias walked across the room until he stood before her. Then he gently took both of her hands. Look at me. She slowly raised her eyes. I did ask God for a wife. She nodded. I also asked him to guide my future. A tear rolled down her cheek. He smiled. I don't believe God lost control because one dishonest man accepted a bribe. She stared at him. I believe sinful people made sinful choices. But I also believe God was able to bring good from them. His voice grew softer. I didn't marry the wrong woman. He squeezed her hands. I married the answer to prayers I didn't even know how to pray. Naomi could no longer hold back her tears. Years of believing she was unwanted, unworthy, forgotten, began melting away. Elias gently embraced her. You once asked me if you were a burden. She nodded against his shoulder. You never were. You've been God's greatest blessing to this ranch. And to me. That evening they walked together to the small hill overlooking the pastures. The setting sun painted the sky with shades of orange and crimson. Hundreds of healthy cattle grazed peacefully below. Naomi smiled through her tears. My father used to tell me something. What was that? He said. God writes straight with crooked lines. Elias laughed softly. I like that. So do I. She looked toward the herd. If Walter had never taken that money? If Silas had never plotted against us? I would have never come here. She paused. I don't thank God for their sin. But I do thank him. For refusing to let their sin have the final word. Elias nodded. That's the difference. We don't celebrate evil. We celebrate God's faithfulness. The truth spread quickly through Helena. By the end of the week, nearly everyone knew what Silas Mercer had done. The stagecoach records were examined. Walter's written confession was delivered to the county sheriff. Soon afterward, investigators began looking into Mercer's business dealings. They uncovered far more than anyone expected. Bribery, false land claims, stolen cattle brands, fraudulent contracts. Witnesses who had remained silent for years finally came forward. Even Clyde Benton, seeing Mercer's empire beginning to crumble, confessed his own involvement in the sabotage against Turner Ranch. The evidence became overwhelming. One afternoon, 2 deputies rode through the gates of Mercer Ranch. Silas watched them approach from his porch. For the first time in many years, the powerful rancher looked afraid. His empire, built on greed and deception, had begun to collapse. Not because Elias sought revenge, but because truth has a way of coming into the light. A few days later, Owen, the young ranch hand who had once betrayed Turner Ranch, returned quietly to the front gate. He looked healthier than before. Humbler too. He removed his hat. I've finished making restitution. I've worked every job I could find. I've repaid every dollar Clyde gave me. Elias smiled. I heard. Owen looked down. I don't expect anything. Naomi stepped forward. But are you still willing to work honestly? Every day. She smiled. Then welcome home. Tears filled Owen's eyes once again. This time. Not because of guilt, but because grace had given him a second chance. As summer approached, the Turner Ranch entered its busiest season yet. Buyers continued arriving. Letters poured in. Families sought advice. Young ranchers came hoping to learn. Yet every evening, when the day's work was finished, Elias and Naomi still sat together on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and a well-worn Bible between them. Success had changed their circumstances. It had not changed their hearts. Far beyond wealth, God had entrusted them with something far greater. A testimony. And in the years ahead, that testimony would spread far beyond the fences of Turner Ranch, touching lives they would never fully know. 5 years passed. The seasons continued their faithful rhythm across the Montana Territory. Spring brought newborn calves and fields of wildflowers. Summer filled the valleys with tall green grass. Autumn painted the cottonwood trees in brilliant gold. Winter blanketed the mountains in white before quietly giving way to spring once again. Through every season, Turner Ranch continued to flourish. But if anyone asked Elias what had changed the ranch, he always gave the same answer. It wasn't better cattle. It was better stewardship. And if someone asked Naomi how she had become such a successful cattle breeder, she smiled and answered, I simply paid attention to what God had already placed in his creation. The ranch itself had grown far beyond anything Elias once imagined. Where a single weathered barn had once stood, 3 sturdy barns now overlooked the valley. New corrals stretched across the property. Additional grazing pastures had been carefully fenced and rotated according to Naomi's pasture management system. The spring that had once been the reason greedy men coveted the ranch now watered several connected reservoirs, ensuring every pasture remained healthy even during dry summers. The bunkhouse had doubled in size. The kitchen table had become longer too. Not because of wealth, because there were always more people to feed. Traveling pastors. Widows looking for work. Young ranchers seeking advice. Neighbors stopping by after church. No one left Turner Ranch hungry. One bright June morning, Elias walked toward the breeding pasture with Owen. The young man had changed remarkably since returning to the ranch. He worked harder than anyone. He never complained. He treated every responsibility as though it were a gift instead of an obligation. As they watched several yearling bulls grazing peacefully, Owen smiled. "I still can't believe people are traveling from Wyoming just to buy our breeding stock." Elias chuckled. "They aren't coming because of us. They're coming because healthy cattle produce healthy families." Owen nodded thoughtfully. "I've learned something here." "What is it?" "A ranch isn't measured by the size of its land." Elias smiled. "No. It's measured by the character of the people caring for it." Elias placed a hand on his shoulder. "I think you've learned exactly the right lesson." Meanwhile, Naomi had become just as respected among ranchers as Elias. Every Tuesday afternoon, women from neighboring ranches gathered beneath the large cottonwood tree beside the house. Some brought sewing. Others carried notebooks. Many simply came with questions. On this particular afternoon, nearly 20 women sat together while Naomi demonstrated how to organize breeding records. Mrs. Harris raised her hand. "I've never kept records before. Where do I begin?" Naomi smiled warmly. "With one page." The women laughed softly. She held up a blank notebook. "You don't need perfect handwriting. You don't need expensive paper. You only need consistency." She carefully wrote 4 headings. Date, animal, observation, action taken. Mrs. Donnelly looked surprised. "That's all?" Naomi nodded. "Most important discoveries begin with simple observations." She looked around the circle. "My father used to tell me, the smallest details often become tomorrow's greatest wisdom." Every woman began writing. Not everyone came seeking ranch advice. Some came carrying broken hearts. One afternoon, a young widow named Rebecca arrived holding the hand of her 7-year-old son. She looked exhausted. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Naomi immediately welcomed her inside. "You're never a disturbance." Over tea, Rebecca quietly shared her story. Her husband had died during the previous winter. Debt collectors planned to take her small farm. She didn't know how to keep it. "I don't have enough strength." Naomi gently reached across the table. "You have enough." Rebecca looked down. "I don't." "You do. I've seen women survive things they never imagined." Rebecca wiped away tears. "But I don't know anything about farming." Naomi smiled. "Then we'll teach you." The following morning, Elias loaded a wagon with seed, fencing supplies, and 2 young milk cows. Owen climbed onto the wagon seat. "You really think 2 cows will make that much difference?" Elias smiled. "They're not just cows. They're hope." For the next several weeks, the ranch hands helped repair Rebecca's fences. Naomi taught her bookkeeping. Mrs. Harris organized meals until the farm became productive again. No one expected payment. Months later, Rebecca's farm became successful enough to support her family. She never forgot the kindness she had received. As Turner Ranch prospered, letters continued arriving from across the Western Territories. One afternoon, Ben carried another stack into the house. "More mail." Naomi laughed. "I've never written so many replies." Elias looked through the pile. "This one's from Colorado. And here's one from Oregon." Another letter came from a church in Kansas asking Naomi to share her father's breeding methods with struggling ranch families. She looked uncertain. "I've never spoken before a large group." Elias smiled. "You've been teaching people your whole life." "I've only been having conversations." The best teachers do exactly that. Several months later, Naomi stood inside a crowded church hall surrounded by ranchers from 3 different territories. She wasn't there to impress anyone. She simply opened one of her father's journals. "My father never believed knowledge should be hidden. He believed wisdom becomes a blessing only when it's shared." For the next hour she explained careful stewardship, honest record-keeping, responsible breeding, and trusting God with every season. When she finished, the audience stood in grateful applause. Naomi quietly bowed her head. The applause belonged to God, not to her. One evening, Elias found Naomi standing alone inside the barn. She was gently brushing an elderly cow that had lived on the ranch since before they married. "You've always liked this one." Naomi smiled. "She's one of my favorites." Elias laughed. "I know." She looked thoughtfully at the animal. "Do you remember the first day I came here?" "I remember every detail. I remember hearing everyone whisper." He nodded slowly. "So do I. They thought I couldn't help. You helped more than any of us imagined." She shook her head. No. God did. She gently stroked the old cow's neck. I simply stopped believing what other people said about me. Elias stood beside her. You know, I almost feel sorry for Silas. Naomi looked surprised. You do? He spent his whole life trying to own more. But he never learned how to care for what he already had. She nodded quietly. Greed always promises satisfaction. But it never keeps its promise. A few weeks later, the county fair arrived. Ranchers traveled from every direction, bringing their finest livestock for judging. Children laughed as horses pulled brightly decorated wagons through town. Musicians played lively fiddle tunes beneath colorful banners. The annual cattle competition was the event everyone anticipated. For years, Silas Mercer had won nearly every major prize. Now, his ranch no longer competed. Instead, people gathered around the Turner cattle. Judge after judge carefully examined the animals. Healthy muscles, strong bone structure, calm temperament, excellent condition. Finally, the chief judge stepped onto the small wooden stage. Ladies and gentlemen, this year's grand champion herd belongs to. He paused dramatically. Turner Ranch. Cheers erupted across the fairgrounds. Ben threw his hat into the air. Pete laughed louder than anyone. Even Curtis wiped tears from his eyes. Years earlier they had doubted Naomi. Now they watched her walk quietly onto the stage beside Elias. The judge handed Elias the blue ribbon. Instead of keeping it, he turned toward Naomi. This belongs with you. She gently pushed it back toward him. It belongs with all of us. Pete called from the crowd. It belongs in the dining room where everybody can see it. Everyone laughed. The ribbon eventually hung in the ranch office. Not as a symbol of pride, but as a reminder of what faithfulness could accomplish. That evening, after the celebration ended, several young ranchers gathered around the campfire. One finally asked Elias, "What's the secret?" He smiled. "There isn't one. There has to be." "No." He looked toward Naomi. "The Lord gave my wife wisdom. He gave us both the opportunity to work. And He expected us to use both faithfully." Another young man asked Naomi, "If you could teach us only one lesson, what would it be?" She thought for a long moment. Then she picked up a single handful of Montana soil. "This." The young men looked puzzled. She let the earth slowly fall through her fingers. "My father taught me that we're only caretakers. This land belonged to God before we arrived. It'll belong to Him after we're gone. The cattle aren't really ours. The harvest isn't ours. The success isn't ours." She smiled. "When we remember that, we become better stewards." Silence settled around the campfire. The young ranchers understood. They had come searching for business advice. Instead, they found wisdom. As the years continued passing, Turner Ranch became known throughout Montana as the finest breeding operation in the territory. Its cattle brought the highest prices. Its records became the standard many other ranches followed. But the Turners were remembered for something even greater: mercy, integrity, generosity. Families often said, "If you're in trouble, ride to Turner Ranch. They'll help if they can." Children who had grown up visiting the ranch later told their own sons and daughters about the husband and wife who never allowed success to harden their hearts. One autumn evening, after another long day's work, Naomi quietly walked upstairs. She opened the old cedar chest beneath their bed. Inside rested the patched blue dress she had worn when she first arrived in Montana. Beside it sat the weathered wooden suitcase. And beneath that, her father's journals. She gently lifted the first notebook. Its leather cover had become soft with age. The familiar verse still appeared inside the front cover. "Commit thy works unto the Lord, and thy thoughts shall be established." Naomi smiled. So much began with these pages. Elias appeared quietly in the doorway. "You still read them?" "Every month." He walked beside her. "Why?" She looked lovingly at the old journals. "They remind me where everything started." She touched the patched dress. "And this reminds me of who I used to believe I was." Elias looked at her tenderly. "And who do you believe you are now?" She smiled through grateful tears. "A daughter of God, who finally stopped listening to the voices that said I wasn't enough." Elias gently closed the cedar chest. "No," he whispered. "You finally started listening to the voice that mattered most." Outside, the setting sun bathed Turner Ranch in golden light. The richest herd in Montana grazed peacefully across the rolling hills. But the greatest legacy growing on that land could never be counted in cattle. It was growing inside people. Inside families. Inside every life touched by grace. And that legacy would endure long after the last hoofprint disappeared from the Montana prairie. 25 years later, the Montana Territory had become the state of Montana, but some things had never changed. The mountains still stood proudly against the horizon. The spring that flowed through Turner Ranch still ran clear every season. The prairie still turned golden every autumn before sleeping beneath winter snow. And every morning, just as he had done for decades, Elias Turner stepped onto the front porch carrying the same worn leather Bible. His hair had turned silver. Deep lines marked the corners of his eyes. His hands bore the scars of 40 years of honest labor. Yet when he opened the scriptures, his smile was exactly the same. He adjusted his spectacles and quietly read aloud. "The steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord." A familiar voice came from behind him. "And he delights in his way." Elias looked up and smiled. Naomi walked onto the porch carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. Her own hair had turned white, neatly gathered beneath a simple bonnet. She still walked with the same slight limp. Age had slowed her steps. It had never diminished her joy. Elias accepted the coffee. "You still remember the verses before I finish reading?" She laughed softly. "You've read that psalm every spring for 25 years. I suppose I have. And I still love hearing it." They sat together in the old rocking chairs that had witnessed nearly every chapter of their married life. For several peaceful moments, neither spoke. There was no need. Some silences are filled with gratitude. The ranch had become larger than either of them had ever imagined. The once small homestead now stretched across thousands of carefully managed acres. Healthy cattle grazed in distant pastures. Windmills turned slowly in the morning breeze. New barns stood where weathered sheds had once leaned. But the greatest change wasn't the buildings. It was the people. Children's laughter echoed across the yard. Grandchildren raced each other toward the corrals while 2 loyal sheepdogs tried unsuccessfully to keep up. The oldest grandson, Caleb, now 20 years old, had become an excellent rancher. His younger sister, Hannah, preferred keeping the breeding records. Everyone smiled when they realized she organized the ledgers exactly the way Naomi had. Their youngest grandson, Josiah, was only 10. He asked more questions than anyone else on the ranch. That morning he ran across the yard carrying a wooden toy horse. "Grandpa." Elias laughed. "Good morning, partner." Josiah climbed onto the porch. "Can I ask you something?" "You usually do." The boy grinned. "Is it true Grandma wasn't supposed to come here?" Naomi looked at Elias. He smiled gently. "I suppose he's old enough to hear the story." Josiah sat cross-legged at their feet. Caleb and Hannah soon joined him. Even several ranch hands paused nearby, smiling as they listened. Although they all knew the story, they never grew tired of hearing it. Elias leaned back in his chair. "When I was younger, I prayed every day that God would send me a wife." Josiah nodded eagerly. "I know that part. I expected everything to happen one way. But people made sinful choices. They lied. They cheated. They tried to hurt us." The boy frowned. "Mr. Mercer." "That's right. Did God make him do those bad things?" Elias answered immediately. "No. God never leads people into sin. They chose those actions themselves." Josiah thought for a moment. "Then how did Grandma get here?" Naomi smiled. "Because God is able to bring good out of things he never approves of." She looked across the valley. "The people who tried to ruin our lives failed. Not because evil wasn't real, but because God's faithfulness was greater." The children sat quietly thinking about her words. Later that afternoon, Turner Ranch welcomed visitors from across Montana. Every year, on the anniversary of the ranch's founding, neighbors gathered for a community celebration. Long wooden tables were placed beneath the cottonwood trees. Fresh bread cooled on the windowsills. Roasted beef, vegetables, pies, and preserves filled every table. Children played games in the open fields. Fiddlers entertained families beneath colorful banners. Before the meal began, Pastor Samuel, now gray-haired himself, stood to pray. His voice carried across the gathering. "Heavenly Father, thank you for every blessing represented here today. Thank you for faithful hands, generous hearts, and for reminding us that true wealth is measured in lives changed, not possessions gained. In Jesus' name, Amen." "Amen," the crowd echoed. As everyone ate together, old stories naturally returned. Thomas Wilkins laughed while speaking to several younger ranchers. "I'll never forget the winter of '87. I thought my herd was finished." Mrs. Harris smiled. "If Naomi hadn't insisted on storing extra hay, my family would have lost everything." Rebecca, now a successful ranch owner herself, nodded. My farm still stands because Turner Ranch believed in me before I believed in myself. One young rancher listened carefully. I've heard these stories all my life. Are they really true? Pete, now nearly 70 and still wonderfully stubborn, laughed loudly. Son. If anything. We don't tell half of what happened. Everyone laughed. After lunch, Caleb led several visitors through the breeding pastures. One businessman from the east admired the healthy cattle. I've visited ranches all over the country. I've never seen animals this calm. Caleb smiled. My grandmother always said cattle remember how they're treated. The man looked surprised. Really? We believe kindness isn't just good for people. It's good stewardship. Another visitor asked. So this really is the richest herd in Montana? Caleb looked across the pasture. I suppose it depends how you define rich. The businessman laughed. How else would you define it? Caleb smiled. Our cattle are valuable. But that's not why this ranch is rich. He pointed toward the workers repairing a fence together. Several of them had once been orphan boys the Turners had raised. He pointed toward another pasture. A family worked there whose father had rebuilt his life after serving time for cattle theft decades earlier. Near the barns, Rebecca's grown son now managed the feed operation. Former strangers had become family. Our greatest wealth, Caleb said quietly, walks on two legs. As the afternoon faded into evening, Josiah wandered upstairs into Naomi's room. The old cedar chest remained beneath the window. Curiosity tugged at him. He gently lifted the lid. Inside rested the faded blue dress, the weathered wooden suitcase, and the stack of worn journals. Naomi quietly entered behind him. I wondered where you'd gone. The boy looked embarrassed. I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize. She sat beside him. You found my treasures. He picked up the patched dress. Were you really wearing this when you came here? I was. It looks old. She laughed. It was old then. He looked at the suitcase. Is this all you owned? Almost. What about these? He carefully lifted one of the journals. My father's notebooks. Josiah opened the first page. He slowly read the familiar verse. Commit thy works unto the Lord. He looked up. You've never thrown these away. Naomi smiled. I never will. Why? She gently took the journal into her hands. When I arrived here, most people saw this dress. She touched the worn fabric. They saw the limp. They saw the suitcase. They believed they understood my value. She opened the notebook. But God saw this. The gifts he had quietly been preparing all along. Josiah listened closely. She looked directly into his eyes. Never decide someone's worth by what you first notice. You may be looking at someone God intends to use in extraordinary ways. The boy nodded slowly. I'll remember. That evening, as the sun settled behind the mountains, everyone gathered one final time near the porch. The grandchildren sat at Elias and Naomi's feet. Neighbors filled rows of benches. Several visitors from distant ranches stood quietly nearby. Someone asked Elias to say a few words. He slowly stood. The years had bent his back a little. But his voice remained steady. When I was a younger man, I believed success meant building the best ranch. He looked toward Naomi. Then God taught me something better. He reached for her hand. The greatest blessings often arrive in packages the world rejects. Many people smiled. Some quietly wiped away tears. He continued. The world told me my wife would ruin this ranch. The world was wrong. He looked toward the children. She didn't simply build Montana's richest herd. She built stronger families. Better neighbors. Honest workers. And she reminded every one of us that wisdom, humility, and faithfulness are treasures no amount of money can buy. The crowd applauded warmly. Naomi gently squeezed his hand. When the applause faded, she stood beside him. I'd like to say one thing. The gathering became quiet. I've spent many years hearing people praise what happened here. She looked across the ranch. But if you remember only one thing about Turner Ranch, don't remember the cattle. Remember the kindness. Remember the forgiveness. Remember that every good thing growing here began with the grace of God. And when someone the world calls useless crosses your path. She paused, her eyes shining with emotion. Look again. You may be standing in the presence of someone carrying gifts heaven has been preparing for years. Silence settled over the crowd. Not the silence of uncertainty. The silence that comes when truth reaches the heart. Long after darkness covered the valley and the guests returned home, Elias and Naomi remained on the porch. Lantern light flickered softly beside them. The ranch rested peacefully beneath a sky filled with stars. In the distance, cattle moved quietly through the moonlit pasture. Elias looked toward the old spring that had started so much conflict years ago. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Mercer had simply left us alone?" Naomi smiled. "I've wondered. What do you think?" She leaned gently against his shoulder. "I think we still would have trusted God. Perhaps our story would have looked different. But his faithfulness would have been exactly the same." Elias nodded. "I believe you're right." For a while they simply listened to the sound of flowing water. The same spring greedy men had once tried to steal. The same spring that had quietly nourished generations of cattle and generations of people. Years later, after Elias and Naomi had both gone home to be with the Lord, travelers still stopped at Turner Ranch. Some came to purchase breeding stock. Others came simply to hear the story. The old wooden box remained carefully preserved in the ranch office. Inside were the journals that had transformed a ranch. Beside it rested the faded blue dress. Visitors often asked why such ordinary things were displayed with such honor. Caleb always gave the same answer. Because they remind us that appearances can deceive. He would gently open the first journal and read the familiar verse aloud. "Commit thy works unto the Lord, and thy thoughts shall be established." Then he would smile. "My grandparents taught us that the richest herd in Montana wasn't their greatest achievement. Their greatest achievement was teaching every generation after them that God's grace can turn rejection into purpose, hardship into blessing, and ordinary lives into extraordinary legacies." And so the story of Turner Ranch lived on, not merely in the strength of its cattle, but in the countless hearts changed by a husband and wife who chose faith over fear, forgiveness over bitterness, and obedience over pride. Final moral. People may judge your appearance, your past, your weaknesses, or your circumstances, but God sees the gifts, purpose, and potential He has placed within you. Human schemes may bring hardship, but they can never overturn God's ultimate purposes for those who trust Him. True wealth is not found in land, livestock, or possessions. It is found in faithful stewardship, generous hearts, forgiving spirits, and a legacy that points future generations toward Christ. That is the kind of inheritance that never fades.